Not only that, but we have the 1977 Additional Protocol 1 of the Geneva Conventions, Article 36, which requires states to review new weapons, means, and methods of warfare, and operates from a principle that practical policy and legal controls over weapons should be founded on, and these are very important words, publicly transparent and evidence-based analysis for prevention of unintended, unnecessary, or unacceptable harm. And here's the key point, should be open for ongoing review. Then we have, in 1995, because 25 years had passed and the 1970 treaty was still around, but not very much traction had been gained around it, there was in 1995 an indefinite renewal of the Nuclear Prohibition Treaty. And in 1996, there was the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty that remains unimplemented. So in other words, we've already got on the books of our world government some very clear, strong pieces of legislation, but they have not been implemented. It's the difference between words and action. Let me give you a couple of quick examples of Canadian leadership in international non-proliferation. So let's pause for a moment and unpack that word, non-proliferation. Basically what this means is that the thrust of these agreements and this diplomacy is to stop the production of more nuclear weapons. And let me pause just to ask you a question. As human beings, how many times can we die? Is there anyone in this room that believes that he or she or they can die more than once? So when the non-proliferation treaty was put in place, there were already enough nuclear weapons made and ready in our world to kill each one of us more than 10 times over. Already. And what we're facing in very recent governmental announcements, for example from the United States, is an escalation of producing even more nuclear weapons. The approximate price tag that's been quoted is close to $1 trillion more dollars in more nuclear weapons. So for us as Canadians, what I think is important to know, and if you ever get a chance to remind Justin Trudeau, the Member of Parliament who, until this election was called, was our Prime Minister, if you ever get a chance to remind Justin Trudeau, it might be to ask him to think about what his own father did as an international leader in peace. In 1983, long before most of you were born, but in 1983, more than 35 years ago, Justin Trudeau's father went on an international peace mission by himself, building on the relationships that he had made as a Prime Minister of Canada. And he had one reason for visiting all these different countries and all these heads of state, and to visit NATO headquarters as well. And that was to try to convince them, and in particular to try to convince the NATO leaders, that they needed to press the pause button. They needed to understand that there were enough nuclear weapons to kill people many times over, and that the mindset that kept pushing for more needed to switch. There needed to be a pause. There needed to be reflection. And part of what came out of that personal peace mission was, although he was no longer the Prime Minister, subsequent Prime Ministers, both John Turner, Liberal, Brian Mulroney, Conservative, actually established new ambassador positions. They don't exist anymore, but for a period of time, we actually had ambassadors for peace deployed to the United Nations with full ambassador status to focus on peace building. And there's no reason why we couldn't see that again. By 1997, we also had a remarkable treaty that was not specific to nuclear weapons, but it looked at the anti-personnel landmines that had been deposited in conflict zone after conflict zone around the world. And our own Manitoba, then Foreign Minister for Canada for now more than a decade until he retired, President of the University of Winnipeg here in Winnipeg, Lloyd Axworthy, led the governmental push for a new treaty to ban the landmines that were blowing people up, blowing off arms, legs, and crippling many generations as a result after peace had been declared. And that treaty is really an example that I want to hold for you today to indicate that when you have civil society leaders, and I want to argue specifically youth civil society leaders, who articulate that yes, this can be done, and it's wrong, it's completely wrong for landmines to remain buried so that unsuspecting people planting their fields, going to get water, walking their child home from school, are going to end up having their lives and their limbs destroyed as a result of these mines. That treaty, often called the Ottawa Treaty, would not have happened unless governmental leaders like Lloyd Axworthy and civil society leaders like Jody Williams had not worked together to make that treaty possible. So throughout the 90s and right up until the mid-2000s, not that long ago, there were numerous additional resolutions that looked at the need not just to stop making nuclear weapons, in other words, the non-proliferation, but to get rid of them. To get rid of them altogether. And that takes us to the thinking behind the 2017 Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So again, let's unpack the language for a moment. Right up until 2017, we've had language about non-proliferation. The 2017 treaty is about prohibition. It's a ban. It's a nuclear ban, nuclear weapon ban. And this is a very important distinction. So let's take a look at the treaty itself very briefly. What's the what and the how? So we already have almost 2/3 of the members of the UN that indicated that they supported this treaty. And what it would do, once it was activated, is make it illegal for the countries that have signed on to the treaty to develop, produce, test, possess, use, threaten to use, or to transfer to each other nuclear weapons. Now, in July of 2017, the day when Canada was not in the room, 53 states, out of 193 members of the United Nations, 53 states immediately signed the treaty, and 3 of those states also ratified. So what does that mean? Well, some of you in the room have studied with me, have studied human rights, so you understand that signing a treaty is really indicating that, well, you like the idea. You're gonna basically not do anything against that treaty actively once you've signed. But it is not an international legal obligation on your country to sign. It is an obligation that your country is going to work towards getting an agreement to ratify the treaty. And once a country has ratified a treaty, then that country has taken on the legal obligations to do the best they can to actually honor and implement the treaty. So now, 2019, we see 79 countries that have signed the treaty and 32 countries that have ratified the treaty, which makes them states parties to the treaty. Once we reach 50 countries who have signed and ratified, then this becomes an active new international law, a new treaty in the international legal system. So why? What's the push? Why is this a big deal? And why would I be standing in front of you today to say to you as youth leaders and to your allies, those of us who are a long way away from being able to be described as youth, to your allies, this is important for us to focus on. There are so many things that require our attention. And one of the reasons that I'm urging youth leaders to focus on nuclear weapons is because I know every single person in this room is proud of the youth leadership at the UN and around the world on climate change. I'm also willing to bet that many of you in this room have participated in at least one of the actions that have been emerging, coming from the grassroots, coming from local leadership, and then also evident from Greta Thunberg's leadership internationally, and most recently at the UN General Assembly just 2 weeks ago. But I also want to make this link between your actions on climate change and your thinking and understanding and actions on nuclear weapons. There is nothing more devastating to human habitats and to all habitats on Earth than a nuclear explosion. Nothing. This is the big kahuna, folks. This is it. And so, in linking how you understand activism and concern on climate change and positioning nuclear weapons as an integral problem and risk and threat within climate change is what I'm asking you to think about for today.